Morning, good afternoon, good evening. I see some folks from Europe. I see some friends. Today I'm going to talk about the blockchain DLT standardization landscape. I currently serve as the co-chair of the IEEE Blockchain Initiative. Also, recently I took on this role as the vice president of one of the committees under the IEEE Standards Association. Okay, here's the outline of my talk. So first I will talk about the IEEE Standards Association, just a few minutes, and then I'll spend a couple minutes on the blockchain standards. And then finally, I'll get into the blockchain standards landscape. Let's get started. So first topic. So there are over 1,500 projects, standards and pre-standards activities. Some of the well-known standards include Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, in fact, even Ethernet. They're all IEEE standards. We have over 340 corporate members, and there's also individual members. And you will see more how they participate in the standards development process. There's, methods for individuals as well as corporations to develop standards under the IEEE SA. So here I have some of the benefits and outcomes of standards. Standards enable innovation, provides an essential platform on which new emerging technologies and new processes can be built. And also it sets a level playing field for vendors to compete and provide the best product or service for the customers. It also helps with maintaining the quality. Some products have to be certified. In fact, IEEE launched has a certification program, which I will talk about on the next slide. And also on the right side, you see some of the benefits like the performance and also the sustainability, making the technology safe, interoperable, and also sustainable for the future. And economic growth, finally, standards should enable economic growth. So this slide shows some of the programs and services under the IEEE Standards Association. First one is the industry connections. We call that the pre-standards activity. Just, you could basically bring experts together to brainstorm if there is a need for a standard on the topic. And sometimes they publish just white papers, reports. Sometimes they end up submitting a proposal to create a new standards working group. The next topic, which is standardization memberships. You can join as an individual member and you can connect with experts. And there's also conformity assessment. It's very related to the certification. And IEEE also offers registries, alliance management. Third-party alliance could work under this program, and IEEE takes care of the management aspect, the administrative aspect. And recently, open source program was launched. Just check opensource.ieee.org. Okay, there are two different methods for developing standards. Individual method, where technical experts come together and they can submit a proposal to create a new project, and you can create a new working group. And in that case, each individual gets a vote. The other type is the entity type or corporate type, where companies, or it could be even government bodies, universities, participate in the entity type. And in this case, each entity gets one vote, and the entity can actually designate primary person, or they can have alternate representatives. So this is where IEEE is a little different than a lot of the traditional standards development organizations, where you can have an expert can just come in and participate. So it's a pretty open process, no restrictions, you can see here. Now, this slide shows the life cycle of the standards development process. So starting with initiating a project. So as I said, an individual or an entity could actually create a new project, and you can basically have a call for a proposal and send it out to interested parties, mobilize the group. The group will draft the standard. It goes to ballot, approved by the standards board. and then you have to maintain the standard. This is the full life cycle here. We call it a 6-stage life cycle. And on the right side, it just shows some project flow, like some main tasks under each one of these stages. So there are 4 types of documents that are produced by IEEE SA. Number 1 being standards documents, outlines mandatory requirements. And number 2, recommended practices, in which procedures and positions preferred by IEEE are presented. 3 is like a guide, talks about multiple approaches. Could be 3 or 4 different ways of accomplishing good practices. And then number 4, trial use document. These are temporary documents for like less than 3 years kind of life cycle. Now I'll dive into the blockchain standards. So if you go to blockchain.ieee.org in the landing page for the blockchain initiative, and you click on standards, you can actually see 6 industry connections, 7 published standards, and several working groups. And the working groups, they fall in 2 categories: horizontal topics that apply across multiple use cases, and there are also vertical topics. They're vertically focused on a specific use case. So some of the horizontal topics that are covered by the active projects include data format, data management, interoperability, governance, identity, smart contracts, and some of the vertical areas focus these working groups include energy. So energy, we have a project where we are looking at how blockchain can create a democratized energy marketplace. And the other topics are IoT, healthcare, there's fintech, cryptocurrency, and digital asset. Getting back to the energy topic, last year we funded 5 POCs across all over the world to build, basically proof of concept combining blockchain and for transactive energy that will basically use the standards from the framework from this working group. And this year we're planning to fund another 10 projects. Again, will be to demonstrate this concept. Okay, this slide just shows you some of the working groups and published work in standards in green color of how they related to different stakeholders that you see here, such as banks, merchants, exchanges, consumers, government agencies, and so on. And we do have quite a few standards focusing on cryptocurrencies, crypto exchanges, and digital asset in general. Now, I want to dive into the 3rd section, which is on the landscape. It's based on my view of the landscape, and it doesn't represent IEEE's view, or this is called a forest technology life cycle. Every new technology goes through an S curve, starting with the innovation and then all the way to expansion and maturity. There's 4 phases, the 2 main stages. The installation, a lot of innovation happens and infrastructures are being built, and then deployment, where a lot of use cases start showing up on these infrastructures, and then the maturity of actual deployment. And after that, it just becomes invisible. We don't talk about it anymore. It's just part of our life. This will become apparent as I go through this section. There are 3 topics that we will talk about. Number 1, starting with innovation. This is where we talked about everything starts with innovation, and where in the case of blockchain, a lot of innovation is happening in the blockchain open source community. The standards come next. So standards are typically enterprises and governments rely on standards or even specifications to build interoperable products and services. And finally comes the regulation. Policymakers create new regulations to enable adoption of new technologies so it can support the economic growth. We have this stacked on top of each other, but what usually happens is innovation happens first, standards come next in terms of time scale, and then the regulation is behind. You can see regulation typically lags behind the technology innovation. And there's also like an interplay between these, concepts or aspects. So innovation, you can see here is on the left side, which would lead to standardization process, and then comes to standards, technical standards and specifications are built, and then the technology is deployed, and which would enable growth, and then it's just a cycle. A sustainable ecosystem should have this cycle. And this is the traditional cycle, and you will see as we move into the blockchain and open source, it'll change a little bit. We will see that towards the end of the presentation. Okay, this is the landscape. Please don't be disappointed if you don't see your project here. Obviously, you can't put everything on one slide. So I picked, major projects, from my view. So you can see there's 4 quadrants here. I'm actually going to go through each one of these quadrants in this talk, so you get an idea of what's happening in these quadrants. So quadrant A, here you see are standards development organizations. They're called SDOs, or sometimes referred to as standards setting organizations, SSO, ISO, IEC, ITU, and IEEE. And we have CEN, CENELEC, ETSI. And second, we have industry trade alliances, associations, or consortia like EEA, MOBI, BIDA, INEDBA. There's a trade association. I got GBBC, and they work with governments and enterprises, look at policy aspects. And there's IIC. They work on private standards or industry standards or specifications. And then let's move on to C, organizations working on open standards, OASIS, W3C, IETF. They have a lot of standards related to internet. And finally, D, open source community. They develop coding specifications and improvement proposals, which we will talk about on the 4th section of this talk. Everything started with the launch of Bitcoin in 2009, and then now Ethereum, Hyperledger, and so on. Okay, so that was one way of categorizing them. Obviously, some of them, they do get into other areas. For example, IEEE is doing open source now, and some of the organizations here are getting into open source or even open standards. So that's why I put this classification, a different view of the same information, where you can see a crossover to other areas as well. ISO, ITU, CEN, CENELEC, typically they don't have anything focused on open standard or open source, and they're strictly traditional SDOs. Some of the other ones like IEC, ETSI, they're SDOs, but more industrial focused. And then IEEE, as I said earlier, is considered an SDO, industry focused, and they launched an open source a couple of years ago. In W3C, the other ones are like, they're industry focused and open standard. I have the definition on the right side. An open standard is a standard that is freely available for adoption, implementation, updates. The best example is PDF. Now, PDF is an open standard, but we have multiple companies providing applications. And open source, we have the definition there. An open source code is created to be freely available, and most licenses allow for the redistribution and modification of the code, anyone, anywhere. But we have to choose the license. Some examples are shown there: Apache license, MIT license. There's a whole list of open source licenses that you can actually follow redistribution. Now, some organizations such as Hyperledger are industry focused, open source. And as far as I know, Hyperledger is not a standards organization. They develop a platform and they become the specifications for building enterprise applications. In the last two, we have this D quadrant, which is basically purely open source. Basically they have contributions on GitHub or GitLab, and they end up becoming the specification, and community starts building stuff on those. So let's talk about each boxes in the next few slides. And ISO has published 7 standards to date, and they have 10 under development. ITU has published 3 specifications, and there are 5 reports. IEEE, as I mentioned earlier, there are 7 published standards, and so on. So this table shows some of the topics that are being worked on by these organizations, such as identity. You have a lot of work across. You can see ISO, IEEE, IEC, as well as CENTELAC. And governance, we have work going on under IEEE and ISO, interoperability, smart contracts, data management, reference architecture. I see Ramesh Ramadoss is from the European Commission. So he's been trying to bring all these organizations, in fact, a lot of them that I showed you on the slide, create this harmonization. They call it joining forces for blockchain standardization. And they did one in 2020 and one in 2021, 2 years in a row. In fact, a lot of these have MOUs. IEEE has, is a liaison relationship with ISO. Several organizations you see here, they have MOUs, but it's still, the work is happening somewhat independently. The harmonization discussion is an ongoing discussion. As I said, the European Commission has been trying hard to bring them together. Now, let's move on to B quadrant. Industries coming together either to create a common infrastructure or to create specifications or industry standards around certain use cases. Could be, for example, MOBI has a standard on vehicle identity. Here is a list. I picked a few. So EEA, which is basically looking at how the public Ethereum blockchain could be used for enterprise application. So they have created a few specifications like client specification, a few other specs. MOBI, as I mentioned earlier, they have a standard called vehicle identity or VID, and they have several other tech specs. You can see the list here. In ETHEREUM, they work with the European Commission, and they published a report in December 2021, and that was about like the whole landscape. As far as I understand, ETHEREUM doesn't develop standards on its own, but they look at the whole landscape to see how they can create liaisonships and try to harmonize the space. Just recently, Interwork Alliance merged with GBBC, so they have this token taxonomy framework, which you can check out on this website, and IIC. By the way, if you take a look at this data from ESG Intelligence, there's over 433 blockchain consortia. So, but I'm not sure how many of them are still active. There's quite a few still around. This is Forbes 50 was categorized based on the infrastructure used. If you look at the bottom x-axis, you can see the actual technology used, and it turns out that the top 4 are like Hyperledger Fabric, Ethereum with privacy implementations, and some of them are being carried out under EEA, and there's Quorum and Corda. Corda is primarily used in the banking industry. Let's look at C, open standards. Oasis has a project called Origin BX. They're also working with EEA. It's called the EEA Community Projects, where EEA and Ethereum Foundation, they're all involved in terms of developing an open standard for the Ethereum blockchain. And W3C has been working on this since 2017 on verifiable credentials, and they're still active. And IRTF has a working group. There is a working group focusing on decentralized internet architecture or infrastructure. Okay, let's move on to the 4th quadrant, which is the exciting open source community, which where everything got started. Again, I just have a few projects listed here, and there's a lot more. So the open source community, they have their own process. In Bitcoin case, it's called BIP, Bitcoin Improvement Proposal. And similarly, Ethereum has a process called EIP, Ethereum Improvement Proposal. And you can check out all the other ones like Neo, Tezos. So here is the change from the conventional standards innovation circle to the new open source world. So in the case of open source, what happens is the improvement proposals like the ones we just talked about, BIP, EIP. Out of that comes the technical specifications. Based on that, the community will do the upgrade, forking, and then that helps with the ecosystem growth. Now, this is an old chart, but shows you how the Ethereum community has been following this process. They do this forking and doing upgrades, and that was pretty much to show you like how they're kind of doing what the cycle shows. Next, I will show you something related to the token specifications. They are called the ERC20 smart contract for fungible tokens and non-fungible, the ERC 721. And there's a difference between tokens and coins. The coins are typically at the native protocol level. Now, let's talk about how these specifications, these token specifications actually enabled this innovation in the last decade, starting with Ethereum and the programmable feature like these ERC20 tokens enabled ICO, DAO, and in fact DeFi as well. And the ERC 721 token standard enabled a whole new ecosystem like NFTs and games, metaverses. In fact, games and metaverses, they combine both fungible tokens and non-fungible tokens. Just to give you an example, like DeFi, this shows you the total value locked in DeFi protocols. Again, just if you look at only Ethereum, $100 billion, and primarily the ERC20 token specification was used by hundreds of projects. Now let's look at the other ERC 721, the token specification, or sometimes ERC 1155, used on Ethereum to create a whole new ecosystem. You can see 2019 was 123 million. This is the market cap. 2020 was 372. And 2021, last year, it hit $16 billion of market cap. By the way, this is the total number of all blockchains, but ERC 721 is, has a big market share. And so the top projects are shown here. And also the NFTs can be used to represent digital files, such as, photos, audio files, or even video files. And you can see the breakdown of some of the market segments like, art, gaming, and collectibles, metaverse, and even sports, like NBA Top Shot. Now, so far, I've been just talking about primarily Ethereum and how the coding specifications the community came up with enabled this growth of all these use cases. But we have hundreds of other blockchains, and so many applications are being built on each one of these blockchains. And this chart here shows you just the scale of this, right? Magnitude. Like you can see, these are the infrastructure projects, and the applications are built on top of these different blockchains. And this just shows you like number of projects as of March 9th, 500 some DeFi projects, NFTs 533, games, metaverse. And as a matter of fact, there was a report published a couple months ago that metaverse is expected to reach $1 trillion market cap. My goal was to actually give some insight into each one of these boxes. As you can see, traditional organizations, and they're moving relatively slower compared to D, and D is moving like a rocket, and their process is just simply code contributions and community feedback, and then they just keep building applications on top. In summary, there's work happening in all these different areas, and if you want to know some of these in detail, you could check out this report I've mentioned a couple of times, INADBA European Commission report that was published in December 2021. And also GBBC has a program initiative that they map all the standards work happening all over the world. That's my contact information on LinkedIn.
Thanks so much. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat box and we can answer them.
Okay, there's some, okay, I see some questions here. SAE International missing from quadrant A. Okay, I'll take a look, Ben, see what they're doing in the blockchain DLT space. And Daniela, Hyperledger base, so sure, yeah, it falls under Ethereum bucket. What about Tezos blockchain or infrastructure? Okay, I could put Tezos on there on the chart. Some of that might be in the next bucket. Okay, well, yeah, I mean, certainly I know a lot of these comments are, I think I'm open to it. And obviously it's impossible to cover all blockchains and on a short presentations. You know, in fact, you can give a talk on just one blockchain for hours.
Okay, we have another question. I was surprised that there aren't clear standards for privacy in blockchain, especially with PII and payment transaction graphs. Is privacy just lagging standards because of bleeding edge innovation by projects like Zcash and Aztec?
Actually, there are some standards working groups under ISO looking at privacy and security. And as far as that, and also there are privacy implementations on Ethereum blockchain based on zero knowledge proof. So that, you know, if you want to know more, Jeff, I could send you the links to those projects. And of course, there's the other end of the spectrum where you have cryptocurrencies that are used for, you know, privacy reasons, such as Zcash and Monero. I'll look up Aztec. I haven't looked much into that, but yeah, there's work happening. In fact, I believe, you know, European Commission has this project called EPSI, European Blockchain Services Infrastructure, which is focused on some of these aspects like, you know, GDPR compliance and privacy of data. Okay, any other questions?
Have you seen any standards make it far enough to get adopted into regulation at this point?
So I think that might be a question for Rapalas, who's on the call. Is he still there? Rapalas?
Hello everyone, I'm Ramesh Ramadoss from the European Commission. I hope I don't interrupt too much. Yes, we are considering this, building some links with European regulation and basically.
Rapalas, your audio is slow, sorry.
Audio is low.
In and out, yeah.
Is this better now?
Oh, better, much better. Please, yeah.
Excuse me. Basically, in the European Commission, we have some considerations to this direction. The first step is the proposal for Data Act regulation, but currently this is a only legislative proposal, and in there probably we would have some references to smart contracts and standards or standardization activities. There might be other things and other possible ideas. For example, currently we have a legislative proposal for Markets in Crypto Act, in Crypto Assets Act. And if this one passes, there might be a need to develop some sort of standards or some sort of classification for basically sustainable energy efficient blockchains. So these are sorts. Of course, there might be far more standards. For example, there is another one for digital wallets, but these might necessarily be blockchain or ledger related, something to this end. And of course, it also very much depends on our basically policymakers on their decisions to which extent they would like to refer to standardization. But it's definitely, we very welcome all standardization activities and also development of standards which basically are well in line one with another and are not conflicting standards. So this is our
Since, Rapala, since you're speaking, can I ask you a question? So which standards will European Commission consider for regulation?
So as I have said, so currently we have only proposals from the side of the Commission, but if, for example, Data Act would be adopted, then some standards could be part of, basically for smart contracts could be part of that regulation. So basically the regulation would have a reference that this standard is officially recognized by it. And currently what we are looking at is actually the smart contract specification being developed by ETSI. That could be a candidate, but it's at this point of time, it's early. It's a legislative proposal still to be adopted. So it's, you know, it's nothing definitive to say that for sure that this is already has been decided. It is not the case at this point of time.
Thanks, Rapalas. He's the best person to answer that question. He's the policy officer at the European Commission. Thank you, Rapalas.
Thank you.
What else do we have?
We have another question. Do you know the current status of NIST's work on quantum resistant crypto?
Actually, I don't, but I can, you know, I do know folks at NIST, and, you know, perhaps I could check with them. In fact, IEEE has a whole initiative on quantum computing, and we do know folks at NIST. Let me check on that. Ben, you could ping me on LinkedIn. Rudolph.
Okay, we have another question. I heard mentioning the EU wallet standard. Will that wallet only be targeted to persons or also to machines? Is there a link with MOBI VID?
I understand this is again question to me.
Yeah, sounds like it, Rapalas. Yeah, the EU
At
wallet
this
standard.
extent, at this point of time, it's a bit too early to make this type of basically statements. But I personally would expect that it would be not only for persons but also for machines. So that would be basically IoT devices. But at this point of time, it's a bit early to make any definitive conclusions on one side or the other.
Thanks, Rapalas. Anyone here from MOBI? Like, we can talk about the MOBI VID standard. I know from the outside, and I haven't participated in the working groups. I guess, but if not, that's fine. It's related to the EU wallet question. Okay, there's another question. Isaac from Nigeria.
Mm-hmm. How can we make blockchain easily adoptable in huge markets like Nigeria and Africa as a whole? In my opinion, the adoption of blockchain has been very slow in these parts. Do we focus on education of the general public?
Okay, that question has multiple answers, you know, because when you say blockchain adoption, are we talking about cryptocurrency? Are we talking about digital identity? Are we talking about enterprise? Are we talking about government use cases? So there's like, you know, you have the blockchain could be used for, you know, different levels, different use cases, as I said, you know, for running efficient governments, you know, and also for getting money to somebody who doesn't have an identity. So it really depends. I do know, like, there is a blockchain association in Africa. In fact, through IEEE, I've been talking to Ben, who's running this association. But if you have any ideas, you know, please reach out to me. I'll type in my email address. In fact, just to give you an example, like back in 2020, IEEE worked with ETHEREUM Foundation. We organized ETH Lagos in Nigeria, where we did hackathons and a conference, and it was well received. So, you know, IEEE is always open to working with folks. In fact, we have a local group in Nigeria, for example. So I work with the students there, and we are planning a hackathon this year in Lagos. So yeah, I'm just telling you whatever I could do from my point of view, but overall, I think there's quite a few folks on the call, like, this Daniela from Hyperledger. She might be interested in helping this region, and there's many folks here, they might have programs to, help that region. As far as IEEE, I have a goal, and I didn't talk about it today. We have 50 blockchain groups all over the world. And there's 2 in Africa, and my goal is there's 1 in Morocco, 1 in Nigeria. My goal is to start more groups, blockchain groups in Africa. So, we could basically provide education and training and through hackathons and all that. Okay, there's an answer here from Daniela. So Hyperledger has an Africa chapter. So yeah, so the person who, Isaac, right? So please, you could reach out to me, or you could even check out that Hyperledger Africa chapter, participate through that. And yeah, those are good ways for you to get involved.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for a few more questions. So does anyone have any other questions? You can put those in the chat. Aren't any more questions? Thank you so much, Ramesh. It was a great lecture. And thank you to everyone for joining. This lecture is recorded, like I said, so it'll be available on our website and our bulletin as well.
Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.